I have been asked on more than one occasion how a man of my reputation, the Duke of Ashgrove, cold by design, feared by preference, and trusted by no one, came to marry a woman who arrived at my door under a false name, with a lie already blooming on her lips. My answer is always the same. I kept her because she was the only person in 20 years who looked me in the eye without flinching, and because, when the moment came to ruin her, I found I could not do it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it began. It began in November, in the second week of frost, when my housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, brought me a letter and a visitor in the same breath. The letter was from a man I despised, Baron Hector Fenwick, a creditor of the old school, the kind who lent money with a smile and collected with a blade. The visitor, Mrs. Alderton informed me, was standing in the entrance hall with a single trunk and the composure of a woman who had arrived precisely where she intended to be. I read Fenwick's letter standing at my library window, the frost thick on the glass. "Your Grace, I write to introduce Miss Elspeth Vane, a distant connection of the late Countess of Aldermere, who finds herself in reduced circumstances following her guardian's death. She is a sensible young woman of good breeding. I ask only that you extend your customary hospitality for a fortnight until suitable arrangements can be made. I remain, as always, your obedient servant, Fenwick." I folded the letter. I had not, in recent memory, extended customary hospitality to anyone. My house was not a refuge. My doors were not open. And Fenwick, who called himself my obedient servant while quietly holding a note against 3 of my tenant farms, knew this better than most. Which meant he had sent this woman for a reason that had nothing to do with her comfort. I went down to the entrance hall. She was standing beside her trunk, her back straight, her hands folded at her waist, not nervously, not theatrically, but with the particular stillness of a person who has decided that stillness is their best defense. She wore a dark traveling dress, practical and plain, and her hair was pinned with more efficiency than elegance. When she heard my step on the marble, she turned. Her eyes met mine. She did not flinch. Most people, when they see me for the first time, perform some small version of retreat, a step back, a dropped gaze, a swallowed breath. My height contributes to it. My expression contributes to it more. I have been called, in various company, forbidding, severe, and once, by a duchess who had drunk too much at dinner, the most unapproachable man in England. Elspeth Vane met my gaze and held it with something that was almost, but not quite, amusement. "Your Grace," she said, her voice was clear and unhurried, "I am grateful for your hospitality. I shall not inconvenience you longer than necessary." "Miss Vane," I said. I looked at her for a moment more than was strictly polite. "See that you don't." I told Mrs. Alderton to give her the East Wing guest room, the furthest from my library and my private study, and returned to my work. I told myself I did not trust her. I told myself I was watching her. Both of these things were true. What I did not tell myself, because I was not yet ready to examine it, was that I was also thinking about the particular quality of her gaze. Ashgrove Hall in November is not a welcoming place. The wind comes off the downs with a decision that borders on hostility. The corridors are wide and stone-flagged and cold. My grandfather built it to impress, not to comfort, and he succeeded on both counts. Most guests, in my experience, spent the first 2 days shivering, and the 3rd day making excuses to leave. Miss Vane spent the first 2 days exploring. I observed this from a distance. She was not furtive, or rather, she was furtive in the way that a person is when they are curious rather than guilty. She walked the long gallery in the morning, studying the portraits with the focused attention of someone learning rather than admiring. She found the estate library, not the library I used, but the older one on the ground floor, the one with the rolled maps and the household ledgers going back to 1743, and she spent an afternoon in it. I found her there on the 3rd day, standing at the long table with a ledger open in front of her, making notes on a small card. "The East Wing drainage accounts," I said from the doorway. "Fascinating reading." She looked up without startling. That quality of hers, the refusal to be caught off balance, was already becoming familiar to me. "The 1798 drainage scheme is remarkably well documented," she said. "Your grandfather's steward kept extraordinary records. Most estate stewards of that period were rather more casual." I walked into the room. "You know a great deal about estate stewardship for a lady's companion." The pause she gave was barely a pause at all. "My late guardian had a large property in Northumberland. I spent a great deal of time in his estate office." It was a smooth answer. It was also, I was almost certain, not entirely the truth. I sat down across the table from her and said nothing for a moment, watching the candlelight on the ledger pages, watching her hand where it rested on the card. "Miss Vane," I said, "why did Fenwick send you here?" She looked up again. This time something moved behind her eyes, not fear exactly, but a close cousin to it. Then it was gone. "I told you," she said. "I am in reduced circumstances following my guardians." "Yes," I said, "you told me. I am asking what you were not told to tell me." The silence between us was the kind that is weight. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at the ledger, closed it with one careful movement, and said, "I am sure I don't know what you mean, Your Grace." She gathered her card and her pencil and left the room at a pace that was not quite retreat. I sat in the library for a long time after she had gone, looking at the closed ledger and thinking about Fenwick, and about the particular quality of a woman who could lie to my face without blinking and who also, it seemed, genuinely found 18th century drainage records interesting. It was, I decided, a perplexing combination. On the 5th day the snow came. It came in the night, quietly, as the worst things often do, and by morning the road to the village was buried and the eastern track impassable. My head groom reported that the drifts against the lower wall were chest-high and still building. The Wiltshire Downs in a proper November snow are not scenic. They are simply impassable. Miss Vane, informed of the situation over breakfast, received the news with the equanimity of a woman who has learned not to be surprised by circumstances outside her control. "Then I shall try not to be underfoot," she said. "You are not underfoot," I said before I could stop myself. "The house is large." She looked at me over the rim of her teacup. "That is the most nearly welcoming thing you have said to me since I arrived. Don't mistake it for warmth." "I assure you," she said, "I have made no such error." But she was smiling. It was a small smile, dry and private, the kind a person produces when they are genuinely amused but have decided not to be obvious about it. It was the first time I had seen it. I found myself looking at it longer than I should have. That afternoon, the household boiler seized. In winter at Ashgrove, this is not a minor inconvenience. It is a crisis of the first order. My head footman, Jarrett, had been managing the boiler for 11 years and pronounced it, with grim authority, beyond his capabilities. My estate manager, Mr. Hale, was snowbound in the village. The only man on the property who understood the mechanism was the under-gardener, Phelps, who had once worked in a locomotive yard. But Phelps was 63, his hands were arthritic, and the lower valve was in a space that required both flexibility and a specific knowledge of the pipe arrangement. I was standing in the boiler room, coat off, considering options, when Miss Vane appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Alderton said there was a difficulty," she said. She looked at the boiler with the same focused attention she had given the drainage ledgers. "What is the problem?" "The lower valve," I said. "It needs to be turned and held while the pressure release is operated. The space is too small for Jarrett's hands." "It is not too small for mine," she said. I looked at her. My guardian's Northumberland property had a steam-heated greenhouse, she said, matter-of-factly. I learned the mechanism out of necessity. Shall I try? There was a pause in which I considered and rejected every alternative. Yes, I said. What followed was 40 minutes of genuine crisis management. Miss Vane on her knees in the boiler room, her dark dress quite ruined, her voice steady and technical, calling out valve positions while I operated the pressure lever with Phelps guiding us both. Her hands were small and certain. She did not flinch when the pipe hissed steam near her wrist. She did not complain about the cold or the dirt or the position she was crouched in for the better part of half an hour. When it was done and the boiler was running again and the warmth was returning to the pipes, she sat back on her heels and looked up at me. Her hair had come half loose. There was a smear of grease across her cheek. She said, "The lower valve will need replacing in spring. I would note that in the maintenance schedule." I said, "Are you all right?" It was not the kind of thing I said. I was aware of this even as I said it. She seemed mildly surprised. "Perfectly," she said. Then she looked down at her dress and added with that small, dry smile, "Though I suspect Mrs. Alderton will have thoughts about the state of this." "Mrs. Alderton," I said, "will have nothing but admiration, as do I." She looked up at me again. The surprise in her eyes this time was less mild. I held out my hand to help her up. She took it. That was the moment, I think, looking back. Not the grand gestures that came later, the confrontation, the declaration, the choosing. All of those mattered. But the real moment was a boiler room in a snowstorm, and a woman who fixed what was broken and then asked after nothing for herself. I held her hand one beat longer than necessary. Then I let go and told Jarrett to have hot water brought to her room. The snow kept us housebound for 9 days. 9 days is a long time to share a house with a person you are watching, and who, you are increasingly certain is watching you back, and who is also, day by day, becoming unexpectedly essential. She had a habit, I discovered, of rising early. I rose early myself, and so I began to encounter her in the mornings, in the corridor outside the library, or at the far end of the long gallery where the light came in gray and cold, and she would stand looking out at the buried landscape with a stillness that I came to recognize as thought rather than idleness. We did not talk at first, then we began to. It started with the portraits. She had continued her study of the long gallery, and one morning she asked me about the woman in the blue-gray gown at the eastern end. A small portrait, half hidden behind a larger one, a face I had not thought about in years. My grandmother, I said, before she married, she was a milliner's daughter from Bristol. My grandfather chose her over the objections of his entire family. She looked at the portrait for a moment. She looks as though she knew exactly what she was worth. She did, I said. She outlasted every one of them. The pause that followed was comfortable, in a way I was not accustomed to. You admire her, she said. I admired her enormously, I said. She was the only person in my childhood who spoke to me as though I had a mind worth addressing. Another pause. Then she said, quietly, mine was my guardian's housekeeper. She taught me to read estate accounts. She said it was the only skill that would reliably keep a woman from being at another person's mercy. I looked at her. She was right. She did not answer, but something in her expression shifted, a relaxing of some tension she kept so constantly that I had stopped noticing it was there. The next morning we talked about Wiltshire. The morning after that, about the management of tenant farms in a bad winter. The morning after that she told me, carefully and with some apparent selectiveness, about her guardian, a good man, she said, but impractical and now dead, and his estate gone to a nephew who had no use for a dependent who was past 20 and not marriageable enough to be an asset. She said this last without self-pity. She said it with the flat pragmatism of a woman who had looked the situation in the face and decided to manage it. "And Fenwick?" I asked. The pause this time was different, shorter, tighter. He offered a solution, she said. At the time, it seemed the only one available. She said nothing more. I did not press. But I thought about the word solution for the rest of the day, and about what shape a solution of Fenwick's might take, and about what it might cost the person who accepted it. On the 8th night of the snow, I could not sleep. This was not unusual. I walked the house at night sometimes, from long habit, the long gallery, the library, the south corridor where the windows look out over the walled garden. The garden was buried. The snow had softened everything, rounded the bare rose canes into white humps, filled the stone paths to their edges, turned the winter world outside into something still and almost kind. I was standing at the south window when I heard the sound. It was not dramatic. It was very quiet, a breath carefully controlled that was not quite steady. I turned. Miss Vane was sitting on the floor of the corridor, her back against the wall, a letter in her hands. She had not heard me. She was reading it by the moonlight reflected off the snow, and she was making no attempt to hide the fact that she had been crying, not weeping, not theatrically, but in the way that a person cries when they have run out of other options and there is no one to see them. She heard my step and looked up. For the first time since she had arrived, she did not compose herself immediately. She looked at me for a moment with her face entirely unguarded, tired and frightened, and something else that I could not name but that I felt, with a sudden and unwelcome certainty, as my own concern. Then she folded the letter. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I did not think anyone would be about." "You needn't beg anything," I said. I sat down, not beside her, that would have been too much, but near enough that we were at the same level. "What is the letter?" She looked at the folded paper in her hands. "From Fenwick," she said. "He is coming when the road's clear. He expects," she stopped. Then more quietly, "he expects a report." The word report hung between us. I looked at her. She met my gaze, and I saw in her eyes the particular anguish of a person who has been caught between two things they cannot reconcile: the thing they were told to do, and the thing they have found they cannot do. "Elspeth," I said. It was the first time I had used her given name. I had not planned it. She did not correct me. "Tell me," I said, "all of it." And she did. She talked for a long time. The corridor was cold and the snowlight was strange and silver through the window, and she told me without embellishment or excuse what Fenwick had arranged, and what she had agreed to, and what she had spent the last 8 days finding she could not carry through. Fenwick was not merely a creditor. He had been for the last 3 years quietly building a case, gathering documents, pressuring tenants, buying up debt, to challenge my management of the Ashgrove estates. He believed, on the strength of some old and disputed claim, that a portion of the eastern lands should revert to a trust in which he held an interest. He needed evidence of mismanagement. He could not get into the estate accounts himself. But a plausible visitor, placed inside the household, with access to the household libraries and the trust of a housekeeper who left ledgers unlocked, that visitor might find what he needed and carry it out in her pocket. Miss Vane had been that visitor. She was not a distant connection of the late Countess of Aldermere. She was a woman Fenwick had found in London, in circumstances sufficiently reduced that the offer of a debt cleared, and a reference letter had seemed, at the time, like rescue. She told me this, and she looked at me steadily while she said it, and she did not ask for forgiveness or offer elaborate justification. She simply told me the truth in the plainest words she could find, and when she was done, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. The silence lasted long enough that she looked away. "I found nothing," she said to the window. "For what it is worth, the accounts are in good order. The Eastern land management is." Her voice caught slightly. "It is exemplary, Your Grace. There was never anything for him to find because you have done nothing wrong." "I know," I said. "I should have refused him at the beginning," she said. "I should not have." She stopped again. "I am sorry for whatever that is worth." I looked at her in the snowlight. I thought about the woman in the blue-gray portrait at the end of the long gallery, who had been a milliner's daughter and who had known exactly what she was worth, and who had married my grandfather against every objection because he had seen it too. I thought about 9 days of early mornings, an honest conversation, and a woman on her knees in a boiler room who had not asked for anything when it was done. I thought about what it cost a person to tell the truth when the truth ruined them. "It is worth a great deal," I said. "Go to bed, Elspeth. We will deal with Fenwick when he comes." She looked at me. "You are not," she stopped, started again. "You are not going to send me away tonight." "No," I said. "I deceived you." "You did," I said, "and then you stopped. In my experience, the second of those matters considerably more than the first." I stood, and after a moment held out my hand to help her up. "Go to bed." She took my hand and rose, and stood for a moment close enough that I could see the steadiness returning to her face, the composure reassembling itself. And then she looked up at me and said, very quietly, "Thank you." I did not answer, but I held her hand for 3 seconds after it was necessary, and then I let her go and walked back to the library and sat in the dark for a long time, knowing, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent 20 years being careful, that I was no longer being careful at all. The roads cleared on the 12th day. Fenwick arrived on the 14th, in a hired carriage, with a solicitor's clerk at his side and the self-satisfaction of a man who has laid a careful plan and expects to collect it. I received him in the great hall. I had said nothing to Miss Vane about what I intended. I had told Mrs. Alderton only that we would have a visitor and that she should see to it that the full household staff was present, footmen at the doors, Mr. Hale in from the estate, Jarrett and the senior staff assembled. A domestic arrangement, nothing more. Mrs. Alderton, who had been at Ashgrove for 30 years and had excellent instincts, had carried it out without question. Fenwick came in with the practiced ease of a man who believes he holds every advantage. He smiled at me, the smile of a creditor, and said, "Your Grace, I trust the snow has not caused too great an inconvenience. I have come to collect Miss Vane, and I expect a certain communication she has been preparing." "Have you?" I said. He paused. "I beg your pardon." I said, "Have you?" I looked at him for a moment. "Then you will be disappointed. Miss Vane has prepared no such communication. There was, as she has confirmed after a thorough examination of the estate records, nothing to communicate. The Ashgrove Eastern lands are managed in exact accordance with the trust documents of 1787. Your solicitor is welcome to verify this. Mr. Hale has prepared a complete summary, properly signed, for precisely this occasion." Fenwick's smile had become something thinner. "I had an agreement with Miss Vane." "You had a coercion," I said, "which is a different thing, and which, I should note, I intend to put before my own solicitors at the earliest opportunity." The clerk at his side had stopped writing. Fenwick looked past me, to where Miss Vane had appeared at the foot of the main stair. She had dressed carefully that morning, not finely, she had nothing fine, but with a particular precision of pressed gray wool and straight shoulders, and her hair pinned with the same efficiency she had arrived with, and nothing in her bearing that conceded a single inch. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating. "Miss Vane," he said, "you understand what you are throwing away." "I understand exactly what I am throwing away," she said. Her voice was clear. "The question, Baron Fenwick, is whether you understand what you have thrown away, which is the goodwill of the Duke of Ashgrove, and shortly, your own legal standing with respect to the Aldermere note." Fenwick turned back to me. "Your Grace, this woman is in my debt." "No," I said, "she is not." I produced the document I had had my own solicitor prepare in the 3 days since the snow had cleared and the roads had opened enough for a rider to reach the village. "The note you held against Miss Vane has been purchased by me and discharged in full. She owes you nothing. She is under my protection. And I suggest, Fenwick, that you leave my house before I am tempted to enumerate in detail, to your clerk, exactly how many of your recent financial arrangements will not survive scrutiny. The silence in the great hall was the kind that a house full of staff make when they are very carefully not reacting to something remarkable. Fenwick looked at me. He looked at Miss Vane. He looked at the document. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed. No one moved for a moment. Then Mrs. Alderton said, with great composure, "Shall I have tea brought to the library, Your Grace?" "Yes," I said. "Thank you, Mrs. Alderton." The staff dispersed. The hall emptied. I turned. Miss Vane was still standing at the foot of the stairs. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen before, not the composure, not the dry private amusement, not the careful steadiness. Something open and unguarded and a little undone. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," I said. "You owe me nothing." "I am aware." "Then why?" I walked back toward her. The hall was empty now, the winter light coming through the high windows, the stone floor cold and quiet between us. "Because," I said, "I find that I cannot be disinterested in what happens to you. I have tried, Miss Vane. I am not especially good at it. I have spent 9 days, 14 days, attempting to be reasonable and careful and correctly suspicious, and I have failed on every count." I stopped in front of her. "You arrived in my house with a false name and a letter from a man I despise, and you fixed my boiler, and you looked at my grandmother's portrait, and you told me the truth at considerable cost to yourself, and I find I am not disinterested." She looked at me. "I am also aware," I said, "that your circumstances are reduced, and that you are in a position that might make a man's interest unwelcome or misconstrued. I am not asking you for anything, Elspeth. I am telling you only that if you wish to remain at Ashgrove not as a guest, not as any arrangement that Fenwick could have imagined, but as its mistress, as my wife, I would consider it the best decision I had made in 20 years. The silence between us this time was not the weighted kind. It was the kind that a person holds around a question, while they decide if the answer is real. She said, "You have known me a fortnight." "Yes," I said, "I know." "I came here to betray you." "You came here intending to," I said, "and then you didn't. I find the second matters more." She looked at me for a long moment. Then something in her face settled, not the composure, not the careful steadiness, but something older and quieter and entirely her own, and she said, "I would not be a convenient duchess, Your Grace. I have opinions about drainage schemes." "I have noticed," I said, "and I intend to keep reading the estate ledgers." "I am counting on it." She looked at me, and the small, dry, private smile appeared, the one I had been watching for 14 days, the one that meant she was genuinely amused and had decided not to hide it, and she said, "Then yes. I believe my answer is yes." I had not, in 20 years, allowed myself to feel something as unguarded as relief. It moved through me now like warmth returning to cold rooms, the boiler working again, the pipes coming alive, something that had been shut down for a very long time opening quietly back up. I took her hand, not as I had in the boiler room or in the corridor in the snowlight. This time I kept it. "Elspeth Vane," I said, "you are the worst spy I have ever encountered." "I am aware," she said. "I found myself caring too much about the outcome." I brought her hand up and held it for a moment against my jaw, and she did not pull away, and the winter light was very still in the hall. "So did I said, "as it turns out." We were married in February, in the small chapel on the Ashgrove grounds, with Mrs. Alderton and Mr. Hale and the household as our witnesses, and no one from London, because neither of us wanted them. Fenwick, I was told, attempted one further legal maneuver in March. My solicitors handled it efficiently and permanently. The lower boiler valve was replaced in April. Miss Vane, my wife, oversaw the installation herself and made Phelps sit down and drink his tea while she dealt with the fittings. He told me afterward it was the best replaced valve in the 30 years he had been on the property. I believed him. I still think about the night in the corridor, the snow light and the letter, and the face I had not been meant to see, entirely unguarded, deciding to tell me the truth when the truth cost her everything. I think about what it took for a woman with nothing left to protect to give up the last thing she was protecting. She had arrived at my door with a false name, and she left with mine. I could not have told you, on that first day in the entrance hall, that I would one day consider it the greatest piece of luck in my life. I was too busy being severe and suspicious, and correctly guarded. But she had looked at me without flinching, and I had not been able to forget it. I have never particularly believed in accident. I believe in character, the kind that holds when it would be easier to let go, the kind that tells the truth in the dark at significant cost, the kind that gets on its knees in a boiler room without complaint and then asks after nothing for itself. She had that kind of character. She had it in more abundance than anyone I had ever met. And I had kept her in the end, for exactly the same reason I had discharged Fenwick's note and stood in that hall and put it plainly before a room full of staff. Because she was worth it, because she had always been worth it. And because some things, once you see them clearly, you simply cannot put down.